When World War II ended, you'd think the world would finally get a moment of peace, right? Well, not exactly. In one of the most incredible turnarounds in history, the very allies who had just defeated fascism, well, they almost immediately started to fall apart. This is the story of how that grand alliance crumbled and was replaced by a decades-long rivalry that would define the 20th century. It's the central puzzle here. How on earth did that happen? How did these partners, who had just fought and won a devastating war together, become sworn enemies locked in a new, strange kind of conflict? The Cold War? You know, you see this image on the left, this moment of hope, American and Soviet soldiers celebrating a shared victory. But then, you look to the right and you see the grim reality. A whole continent just shattered. And it was right there, in those ruins, that two totally different ideas about what the future should look like began to take shape. That's where the new conflict really began. So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at that initial shift from allies to adversaries. Then we'll rewind a bit to their wartime alliance, what held it together. We'll dive into their competing visions for the post-war world, see how a cycle of action and reaction took over, and finally, look at how this all led to a world split in two. All right, let's jump in with that huge shift from friends to foes. Now, it's really easy to want to point a finger, to blame one side or the other for starting it all. But the truth is, it's just not that simple. This wasn't a one-way street. The Cold War was really a chain reaction. Think of it like a set of interlocking gears. One side makes a move based on its own fears and its own goals. That turns the gear of the other side, which then reacts. What one country saw as a perfectly reasonable defensive move, the other saw as an aggressive threat. And that spiral of action and reaction is what drove them further and further apart. But before that rivalry got going, there was cooperation. A lot of it, actually. But let's be clear, their alliance during World War II was never about shared values or ideology. It was about one thing and one thing only, a shared enemy. This was a partnership of pure, pragmatic necessity. And it was a pretty interesting balance. You had the US acting as the great arsenal, providing tons of vital aid through programs like Lend-Lease. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was bearing the absolute brunt of the fighting on the Eastern Front, losing millions. Their leaders, Roosevelt and Stalin, they met at places like Yalta to map out the future of Germany and create the UN, but everyone knew this was a temporary deal. Once the common enemy was gone, the alliance was probably gone too. And, well, that's exactly what happened. The moment their common enemy was defeated, those deep fundamental differences in how they saw the world came rushing to the surface. And this is where those first real seeds of mistrust started to get planted. And this right here, this is the core of the problem. The United States came out of the war imagining a world built on self-determination, free elections, and open markets. But the Soviet Union, they had just suffered unimaginable losses. We're talking tens of millions of people dead. For them, the number one priority was security, period. They were determined to have a buffer zone of friendly, compliant governments on their border to make sure they were never invaded again. These two visions were just completely incompatible. This led to this really corrosive mutual mistrust, where each side saw the other's actions through the worst possible lens. So when America saw the Soviets installing puppet regimes in Eastern Europe, they saw aggressive communist expansion. But when the Soviets heard America calling for free elections in those same countries, they heard a plot to install hostile anti-Soviet governments right on their doorstep. Every defensive move was seen as an offensive threat. And it didn't stay as just mistrust for long. Pretty soon, those fears hardened into concrete policies and actions. This is when the simmering tension really boils over into a full-blown geopolitical struggle. One of the first big moves came from the US, was something called the Marshall Plan. Now, on the surface, it looked like an incredibly generous aid package to help rebuild Europe's totally destroyed economies. But underneath, it had a very clear strategic purpose: create stable, prosperous democracies that would be strong enough to resist the lure of communism. This cartoon from the time just nails the idea. You've got Uncle Sam here using a log labeled New American Foreign Policy to get across a chasm. And what's he using to secure that bridge? A big bag of money, economic aid. It's a tool, a weapon, really, to fend off the looming threat of communism on the other side. Money was now a central part of foreign policy. And of course, the Soviet Union reacted. They didn't see the Marshall Plan as generous aid. They saw it as economic imperialism, a sneaky way for the US to buy influence and control Europe. So their response was to tighten their grip on Eastern Europe, and, in the most dramatic move yet, to blockade West Berlin, cutting off all road and rail access to try and starve the Western Allies out. But the US and its allies responded with the incredible Berlin airlift, flying in supplies 24/7 for almost a year. It was a major confrontation, all without a single shot fired between them. And just look how fast this all went down. This wasn't some slow-moving historical trend. The Marshall Plan is announced in 47. The very next year, the Berlin blockade is on. By 49, the airlift is a success, but the division of Germany and really all of Europe is set in stone. The speed of it all is just breathtaking. So where did this super-fast cycle of action and reaction lead? Well, the outcome was almost inevitable. A world, and especially the continent of Europe, was now split right down the middle into two hostile, opposing camps. So when you boil it all down, both superpowers played a huge role in building this new reality. The US used its massive economic strength with things like the Marshall Plan to create a prosperous capitalist West. At the same time, the Soviet Union used its military might to carve out a secure communist East. The key thing to remember is that while neither side actually wanted another world war, the policies they chose locked them into this intense, bitter rivalry. The Cold War wasn't just caused by one country. It was built by two. In the end, it really comes down to this. The Cold War emerged from a series of reciprocal actions, all of them rooted in deep-seated fear, powerful ideologies, and those two totally competing visions for what the post-war world should be. And that history really leaves us with a pretty important question for our own time. If a vicious cycle of fear and mistrust between powerful nations could split the world in two back then, what lessons can we and should we be applying to the global rivalries we see playing out today?